Thank you all. Thanks so much. Thanks, everybody. Thank you all. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Dr. Curran. Thank you very much. And I did really love to visit all those Smithsonian museums and institutions. They were our neighborhood museums, and they're so wonderful. They're such a huge asset to the United States. And so I'm thrilled to be here at the invitation of the Smithsonian Institution. I'm very happy to be in Washington and to see so many friends. Thank you all very, very much for coming out tonight. I know that there are a lot of people who worked in the administration. I think there are volunteers here that have volunteered to open all those letters and help us answer those letters. Thank you all for everything you did for us for the 8 years that we lived here. And thank you so much for coming out to welcome me tonight. I'm thrilled to be back and thrilled to see all of you. You may not know that I actually had lived in Washington twice before George and I moved in the White House. George and I lived in Washington in 1987 and 88 when George was working on his dad's campaign. And my first stay in Washington was during the summer of 1969 when one of my good friends from Southern Methodist University and I headed east to see what life outside Texas would be like. We ended up in Washington. She got a job at the old Garfinkel's department store, and I decided to try my luck at getting a job on Capitol Hill. I set up with an interview with Congressman George Mahon, who was the congressman from my home district of Midland, and he had represented actually Midland, the district that Midland, Texas is in, for as long as the district had been a district. He'd been there almost 35 years. The congressman invited me for an interview. He looked over my resume, and then he asked if I could type or take shorthand. I said no. I'd taken a quick course of typing in summer school and high school, but I hadn't really paid a lot of attention. Congressman Mahon then asked me if I thought my father would consider sending me to secretarial school. And I thought about what my father had just spent to send me to SMU, and I said no again. And Congressman Mahon gently suggested that without being able to type or take shorthand, I wasn't qualified for a position in his office. Had I been a typist, however, in the summer of 1969, I might very well have become a congressional staffer in Washington. Instead, I returned to Texas and to public school teaching and was very happy. Had I stayed in Washington, I might never have met George W. Bush. So in retrospect, I'm grateful that I was turned down by Capitol Hill. And I'd like to take just a few minutes to share with you something from my book about how George and I met in Midland, Texas, and how we both, without realizing it, began our journey to Washington, D.C. For at least a year now, my friend Jan Donnelly's husband, Joey O'Neill, had been telling me that he wanted to introduce me to one of his friends. Jan had gone to Lee High School and had lived with me in Houston at the Chateau de Jean. After spending a few years in San Francisco, Jan and Joey had come home to live in Midland. Joey was working in his dad's oil business, and his childhood friend, George Bush, was working as an oil landman, scouring county courthouse records for land that might be leased for drilling wells. Joey talked up George every time I stopped by to visit Jan. I was in no rush. I had a vague memory of George from the 7th grade, almost 20 years before. I knew that his dad had run for Senate and lost in 1970 when I first moved to Houston, and I assumed that George would be very interested in politics. while I was not. It was late July, one of those high heat days when, come dusk, the sun would, as Willa Cather wrote, left behind it a spent and exhausted world. I put on a blue sundress, drove the car around the corner, and walked up to the door of Jan and Joey's brown brick townhouse. Even the roof was a cedar shake brown. The cicadas were droning, and overlaying their vibrating wings was the steady whir of air conditioners to keep the baking hot houses cool. Joey was at the grill. It was not some elaborate party. It was just the four of us, Jan, Joey, George, and me, sitting out back eating hamburgers. We laughed and talked until it was nearly midnight. The next day, the phone rang. It was George saying, "Let's go play miniature golf." And so we did, with Jan and Joey as our chaperones. The miniature golf course is one of the prettiest places in Midland. It was built among a veritable forest of old elm trees, which had grown tall and graceful even in the West Texas ground. We played golf under the stars and laughed again. Then I went back to Austin, and George started visiting on the weekends. Sometimes he'd fly over on a Friday night, or he would drive, but he came every weekend, except for the very end of August when he left for Maine to see his family. Barb Bush loves to tell the story that George spent exactly one day in Kennebunkport that summer. When he called my apartment, she says, that some guy answered, and he raced for the plane and flew right back down. I returned to the library at Dawson Elementary and worked all through September. By the end of the month, George had asked me to marry him. We'd been dating only 6 or 7 weeks, but our childhoods overlapped so completely, and our worlds were so intertwined, it was as if we had known each other our whole lives. I loved how he made me laugh and his steadfastness. I knew in my heart that he was the one. I looked at him and said yes. That Sunday night, when George arrived in Midland, he headed to Humble Avenue to speak to my parents. A week later, early on a Sunday morning, George and I drove to Houston to meet his parents. He introduced me with the news that we were getting married. After lunch at the Bush's home, George's dad pulled out his pocket calendar and looked over each weekend that fall. In a few minutes, we picked a wedding date, November 5th, 1977, one day after my birthday and one day before the anniversary of that awful accident, and only about 3 weeks away. There was no time even to order printed wedding invitations. My mother wrote and addressed all of our invitations by hand. Far more nervous than either the bride or groom were Jan and Joey O'Neill. Joey and Jan had dated for years before they got married. Neither of them dreamed that their invitation to dinner would lead us to the altar in a mere 3 months. And perhaps it wouldn't have if Joey had introduced us when we were growing up in Midland, or when George and I had lived on the opposite sides of the sprawling Chateau de Jean in Houston, or at almost any other moment prior to that night. But at that particular moment, on that warm summer night, both of us were hoping to find someone. We were not looking for someone to date, but for someone with whom to share life for the rest of our lives. We both wanted children. We were ready to build an enduring future. Those were the facts of our lives when we went to dinner that night. It was the right timing for both of us. Of course, not everyone in Midland agreed. As I was packing to leave Austin, Reagan and Billy were selling their house. A week before the wedding, the mother of a friend of mine from Midland came to see Reagan and Billy's house. She was thinking of buying it for her daughter. She didn't recognize Reagan, but Reagan recognized her and said, "We're going to be in Midland next weekend. We're going to Laura and George's wedding." And without a second's hesitation, this woman said to Reagan, "Yes, can you imagine the most eligible bachelor in Midland marrying the old maid of Midland?"